LeBron James had just wrapped up a demanding morning of training at the gym, his body sore but his mind clear. The team had a big game coming up, but today wasn't about basketball. Today was about taking a break, about enjoying the simplicity of a quiet afternoon. He needed groceries, bananas for smoothies, some vegetables for dinner, and a few other basics that were always in short supply at home. He decided to go to the local grocery store, the one in his Cleveland neighborhood where he had visited countless times before. It wasn't the kind of place that attracted paparazzi or fans. It was a small, community-based store where people knew each other by name, and the hum of everyday errands filled the air. The aisles were lined with products he had seen 100 times before, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as people shopped for their weekend meals. The shelves were stocked with fresh produce, dairy, and canned goods, each item sitting neatly in its place. There was a sense of normalcy here, of routine. LeBron liked it that way. It was one of the few places he could go where he wasn't constantly recognized, where he could blend in with the crowd without attracting too much attention. As he entered the store, he was dressed casually in a gray hoodie and jeans, a stark contrast to the uniforms he wore on the court. The hoodie pulled low over his forehead, his sunglasses perched on his nose just enough to shield him from the prying eyes of passers-by, but not enough to fully conceal his presence. He grabbed a basket and with a calm stride, moved through the aisles. His large frame towered over the other shoppers, but today he wasn't looking to make a scene. He just wanted to get what he needed and go home to relax. The store was filled with the usual crowd, an elderly couple deciding between two different brands of pasta, a mother coaxing her young son to try a new fruit, and a teenager distracted by her phone as she pushed a cart loaded with snacks. LeBron moved past them, nodding politely when he caught someone's eye. He didn't mind the occasional glance or smile, but he didn't want to linger. Today, he was just like everyone else, another shopper going about his day. He passed the meat section, the sound of sizzling sausages from the nearby deli counter filling the air. Then, he turned toward the produce section. The bright colors of fresh oranges and apples caught his attention. He reached for a bunch of bananas, the familiar, smooth skin of the fruit cool in his hand. He checked his phone for any messages, texting back his agent about an upcoming event, when a soft but distinct voice cut through the peaceful rhythm of the store. "You people don't belong here." LeBron froze. His fingers hovered over the screen of his phone as he looked up, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. The words hadn't been loud, but they were clear, sharp, cutting, and deliberate. He turned his head slowly, trying to locate the source of the voice. Near the apples, an elderly woman, perhaps in her late 70s, stood with a bag of Granny Smiths in her hand. Her face was a tight mask of disapproval, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. The moment their eyes locked, she spoke again, her voice tinged with venom. "Why don't you go back to Africa?" she spat, her words slicing through the air with a cruelty that seemed out of place in the otherwise quiet store. A few heads turned in her direction. The quiet hum of the store seemed to stop, replaced by the sudden, thick tension in the air. LeBron's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the words didn't quite register. He had heard racially charged comments before, but never so blunt, so matter-of-fact, in such a public setting. His mind raced. Should he say something back? Should he leave? He stood still for a long moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The elderly woman didn't seem to care who heard her words, her posture stiff and defiant as she clutched the bag of apples tightly in her hands. She didn't back down, didn't apologize. Her glare remained steady, and it felt as though she was daring him to respond. The tension in the store thickened like the air before a storm, each breath LeBron took seemingly heavier than the last. Around him, other shoppers slowly began to react. Some looked away quickly, pretending they hadn't heard, their faces flushed with discomfort. A mother, pushing her child in a cart, steered her little one away from the scene, her eyes wide, trying to avoid any confrontation. An older man near the potatoes glanced nervously at LeBron, unsure of what to do or how to react. But LeBron, despite the rush of emotions flooding his chest, remained still, his calm exterior holding firm. The tension was unbearable, but LeBron didn't flinch. He had learned long ago to stay calm in the face of adversity. In basketball, as in life, there was power in patience, and so he took a deep breath, his fingers slowly lowering his phone. The store seemed to hold its breath, the bustling noise of daily life replaced by the silence that stretched between him and the woman. Her words still hung in the air like an unwelcome cloud, but he wasn't going to let her have the last word. Not today. LeBron had faced many challenges, both on the court and off it, but this was different. This wasn't a game. This wasn't about a win or a loss. This was something much more personal, something that demanded a response, one that wasn't defined by anger, but by dignity and strength. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for him to do something. LeBron's heart beat in his chest, a steady rhythm that kept him grounded even as his mind raced. The silence in the store felt suffocating, thick with tension, as if time itself had paused in disbelief. All eyes were on him now, on the towering figure standing in the middle of the produce aisle, holding a bunch of bananas in one hand and a grocery basket in the other. The elderly woman, still clutching her apples, seemed to be waiting for a reaction, her gaze piercing, almost daring him to respond. Her words echoed in his mind, each syllable sharp and calculated. LeBron stood there for what seemed like an eternity, the weight of the moment pressing on him from all sides. It wasn't just the insult, it was the fact that the words weren't just aimed at him, but at everything he represented. A life of dedication, of struggle, of breaking barriers. He had been called many things in his life, faced countless slights, both big and small, but something about this moment hit harder. Perhaps it was the blatant ignorance, the refusal to see the humanity in others. Or perhaps it was the isolation that came from hearing such hate in a place that was meant to be ordinary, meant to be neutral. He thought about the young fans who looked up to him, the children who saw in him not just a basketball player, but a role model, someone who could rise above it all. He thought of his own children, the lessons he wanted to pass on to them about dignity, respect, and standing up for what's right. He couldn't let this moment pass without responding, not just for himself, but for the countless others who would never have the platform he did to speak out. After what felt like an eternity, LeBron finally exhaled, the tension lifting ever so slightly as he straightened his posture. The crowd, which had remained still up until that point, seemed to lean in, hanging on to his every movement. Even the soft hum of the refrigerators, the rustle of bags, and the shuffle of feet in the aisle seemed to quiet as LeBron took the first step forward, his voice low but steady. He began, his tone measured, almost disarming in its calmness. Do you even know what you just said? The question wasn't a challenge, but more an invitation for her to reconsider her words, to reflect. LeBron's voice had a certain weight to it, an authority that came not just from his stature, but from the years of hard work and experience that shaped him into who he was. He wasn't just a basketball player anymore. He was a man who had faced adversity time and time again, a man who knew the power of words and the strength that came from speaking truth to ignorance. The elderly woman, who had been so confident moments before, faltered. Her eyes narrowed slightly and her lips tightened. She didn't expect this. She had expected anger, perhaps even confrontation. But instead, she was met with a quiet challenge, one that forced her to confront the ugly reality of her own words. I said what I said, she snapped, her voice rising slightly, defensive now, almost as if she were trying to hold on to some shred of control. This is my country, and people like you don't belong here. The words hit like a slap to the face, and for a split second, LeBron's jaw tightened. The nerve of it, he thought. The sheer audacity. But then something shifted inside him. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for him to snap, to retaliate. But this wasn't the time for anger. He wasn't going to let her words define him, and he certainly wasn't going to let this small moment of hatred dictate the rest of his day. Instead, LeBron did something that surprised even him. He took another step forward, placing his basket gently on the floor as he looked her square in the eye. You don't know me, he said, his voice still calm, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath it. You don't know where I come from, what I've been through. But I'm going to tell you anyway. The woman's grip on her apples tightened, her knuckles turning white, but she didn't interrupt. She just stood there, staring at him with a mixture of defiance and disbelief. The crowd had fallen into a near-complete silence. LeBron continued, his words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of generations. My great-great-grandfather was a sharecropper. He began, his voice steady and unwavering, born in Mississippi. He worked the land that he didn't own, breaking his back every day so his kids could have a better life. His father, he was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, sold like property. All so he could help build the very country you're standing in right now. The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into the crowd. A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to speak. LeBron's voice had taken on a strength that was almost palpable, each sentence landing with precision, like the careful strike of a hammer on an anvil. My grandfather fought in World War II, LeBron continued, his eyes never leaving the woman's face. He fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life, only to come back and be treated like less than nothing. He couldn't sit at the same counters, couldn't drink from the same fountains as white people. But he didn't leave, he stayed. He stayed because he believed in the promise of this country, even when it didn't believe in him. There was a shift in the crowd now, a subtle change in the energy in the store. LeBron's words had started to have an effect. He wasn't just speaking to the woman anymore. He was speaking to everyone in the room, the bystanders, the other shoppers, the employees who had stopped what they were doing to witness this exchange. My parents. LeBron went on, his voice softer now but no less powerful. They fought too, not with violence, but by raising me to believe in kindness, respect, and hard work. My mother's a teacher. She spent her whole life helping kids, no matter what they look like. My dad, he's a mechanic. A guy who would stop on the side of the road to help someone like you if their car broke down. The woman's expression faltered for the first time. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The crowd was still, completely absorbed in LeBron's words, feeling the truth of them in their bones. LeBron took a step back, his eyes still locked on hers. "You said I don't belong here," he said quietly, "but I do. I belong here just as much as anyone else. I've paid the price for it, and so have my ancestors." The elderly woman swallowed hard, her face flushed with embarrassment. She opened her mouth again, but this time her words caught in her throat. The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't oppressive, it was reflective. The air in the grocery store had shifted. What had started as a mundane shopping trip had transformed into something far more intense, a silent battleground of words and unspoken emotions. The tension hung heavy, thick like fog, clouding the space between LeBron and the elderly woman. It felt as if the entire store had exhaled in unison, holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. LeBron's words lingered, settling into the hearts and minds of everyone who had been watching. The elderly woman, her lips trembling, stood frozen in place, her grip tightening on the bag of apples she still held in her hands. Her expression flickered between disbelief, anger, and something more elusive, perhaps shame, perhaps regret. She had never expected a response like this. In her world, where her words had often gone unchecked, she had anticipated anger, confrontation, maybe even physical retaliation. But LeBron had given her none of that. Instead, he had met her with quiet strength, with a dignity that made her feel small in comparison. The crowd around them seemed paralyzed, as though unsure of how to react. Some people were visibly uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other, glancing nervously between LeBron and the woman. A few had stopped what they were doing altogether, their shopping carts forgotten in the aisles, as they stood frozen, unsure whether to offer support or avoid further involvement. The murmurs that had once filled the store now seemed distant, like whispers in another room. Everyone was caught in this moment, suspended in the tension of what had just transpired. A woman at the end of the aisle, who had been eyeing LeBron from the moment the confrontation began, shifted closer, her footsteps tentative. She was older, her face lined with years of experience, and she wore the kind of look that came from having seen the worst in the world, but still holding onto the hope that things could change. She exchanged a quick glance with her husband, and without saying a word, she reached out and placed a hand on LeBron's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement of what he had done, a silent thank you for standing up when so few would. The elderly woman seemed to flinch at the touch, her body rigid, but she didn't look away from LeBron. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, as though she was struggling to regain control of the situation. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her words wouldn't come. What could she say now? The things she had said moments before were already hanging in the air, irretrievable. They had been exposed for what they were, hate disguised as ignorance. The store seemed to contract in on itself, the space around them growing smaller. The subtle hum of the refrigerators, the shuffle of feet, and the clink of cans had all faded into a muted background noise. Now, all that could be heard was the slow, rhythmic sound of LeBron's steady breathing and the occasional rustle of a cart. His eyes never left the woman's, but his body language was calm, measured. He wasn't waiting for an apology, wasn't expecting any sort of confrontation. He had already said what needed to be said. The ball was no longer in his court, it was in hers. A man from the dairy section shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting nervously between the two. He cleared his throat, as if trying to break the awkwardness, and then spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "He's right, you know," the man said, his words cutting through the silence with a simple, undeniable truth. "We all have to be better than this." His words seemed to loosen something in the crowd. It was as if a dam had cracked, letting the tension seep out just a little. An older couple who had been standing nearby, exchanging wary glances, nodded in agreement. The woman's eyes were red, perhaps from something personal, something deep. "My father fought in that war," she said, her voice catching slightly. "He always told me that the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. That's what we should care about, what we all fight for." For a brief moment, the elderly woman's expression faltered. Her eyes widened ever so slightly, and she seemed to deflate, as though the weight of the world had suddenly shifted onto her shoulders. She didn't know how to handle this new reality, this world where her words didn't just get dismissed, they were challenged. The store felt smaller now, the tension tangible, but at the same time it was beginning to break, like a cloud lifting just enough for the sunlight to peek through. A young cashier, no older than 20, stepped forward from her post by the checkout counter. Her hands were trembling as she looked at LeBron, but her words were steady. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice rising above the quiet murmur. "I've never seen anyone handle something like that with so much grace." She paused, then added, "I don't think I could have done that." LeBron nodded, his eyes softening. He didn't need her thanks, but he appreciated it. The words of the young cashier, simple as they were, added a new layer to the moment, a reminder that his calm, his strength, was not only being witnessed by the woman who had insulted him, but by others too. And it was making a difference. The elderly woman, her face flushed with a mixture of confusion and shame, looked around, almost as if searching for someone to come to her defense. But the crowd, which had been hesitant at first, had now turned. They were no longer complicit bystanders, they had become witnesses to something far bigger than a simple grocery store exchange. They had become a collective force, challenging the ignorance that had manifested in that one sharp, hateful comment. The silence remained, but it had shifted. It was no longer a silence of tension, but one of contemplation. Even as the elderly woman began to wheel her cart away, her eyes lingering for just a second on LeBron, it was clear that the moment was far from over. The conversation had begun not just in the store, but in every heart present. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful shift of all. LeBron stood still, his tall frame unwavering in the thick silence that followed the elderly woman's hurtful words. The store, once filled with the hum of normal activity, now felt like a stage set for something much larger than a grocery run. Every eye in the store had turned toward him, waiting to see how he would respond. He didn't rush. His thoughts moved quickly, but his body was calm, controlled, an anchor in the storm of tension that had suddenly erupted. The elderly woman's words still hung in the air, sharp and jarring, but LeBron's reaction was anything but what the woman expected. Instead of anger, instead of a sharp retort, he inhaled deeply, grounding himself. There was no need to escalate things. The intensity of the moment didn't overwhelm him, it focused him. His gaze met the woman's, not with fury, but with a quiet strength that seemed to shift the very energy of the room. The crowd, tense as ever, felt the power in his stillness. LeBron's voice was steady, measured, cutting through the silence like a soft but firm command. His words were deliberate, not rushed. "Do you even realize what you just said?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but reflective, as though giving the woman the space to reconsider her words. The elderly woman blinked, clearly startled by his response. She had expected him to react in kind, to lash out or retaliate in anger. Instead, he stood before her as though she had simply made an error, a mistake that could be corrected. She shifted uncomfortably, clutching the bag of apples as though they were her only defense against the growing scrutiny. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice sharp, but now tinged with a slight hint of uncertainty. The confidence she had carried earlier was beginning to waver. She had been so sure of herself moments ago, but now, under LeBron's unwavering gaze, her words felt out of place, out of time. LeBron didn't flinch. He remained calm, his posture firm but not aggressive. "All right," he said slowly, his voice never rising, yet carrying a weight that seemed to draw the attention of everyone around them. "Let's talk about that." He took a small step back, his eyes not leaving hers, giving his words room to settle before he spoke again. "You said I don't belong here, but let me tell you something." The woman's expression shifted, though she still refused to back down. LeBron's voice dropped a notch, but his words carried a power that made the air feel heavy. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi. He worked as a sharecropper, breaking his back on land he didn't own, fighting every day to give his children a better life." He paused, his words sinking into the silence like stones thrown into a pond. "Before him, my great-grandfather was a slave. He was beaten, sold, and treated as property." The room seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the refrigerators and the distant clink of cans fading into the background. LeBron's story was not just about history, it was about the very essence of struggle, resilience, and the ownership of a life that had been hard-won. And for what he continued, his voice gaining strength. "To help build this country. The one you say I don't belong in." The woman shifted again, this time her fingers trembling on the bag of apples. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. It was as if LeBron had exposed something deeper in her than just the words she had spoken. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding an apology. He was simply presenting a truth she had never considered, and it was one she wasn't ready to face. LeBron didn't raise his voice. There was no anger in his words, just a quiet conviction that made the space around them feel smaller. "My grandfather fought in World War II," he continued. "He risked his life for this country, but when he came back, he couldn't sit at the same counters as the white men he had fought beside. He couldn't drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why? Because he believed in this country, even when it didn't believe in him." The woman's face had paled, her expression now a mix of confusion and discomfort. The words LeBron spoke were not just a retort, they were a history, a narrative she had never bothered to understand, let alone acknowledge. And as he spoke, she began to feel the weight of those words pressing down on her, the layers of privilege and ignorance peeling away in the face of undeniable truth. LeBron didn't let her silence stop him. He pressed on, unwavering. "My parents, they fought too, not with fists, but with hard work. My mother's a teacher, and my father's a mechanic. They taught me the value of kindness and respect." His voice softened, but his message remained firm. "I could have walked away. But that wouldn't have helped. Ignorance doesn't get better when we stay silent." The store was utterly still. Even the employees who had been avoiding eye contact now looked on, some with their mouths slightly agape, others nodding in quiet agreement. LeBron wasn't asking for an apology. He was showing the woman, showing everyone in the store that silence was not the answer to hate. In the calm of his words, the woman seemed to shrink, her defiance dissolving under the weight of history and dignity. And yet, she did not speak. Instead, she stood there, a witness to the truth she had tried to dismiss, and for the first time in a long time she was unsure. LeBron's calm response wasn't just a rebuke, it was a lesson. One that echoed far beyond the grocery store aisles. The store was still, as if frozen in time, the hum of background chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. LeBron's words lingered in the air, not just for the elderly woman, but for everyone within earshot. Each shopper seemed to stand a little straighter, as if the gravity of his history had shifted something deep within them. The elderly woman remained rigid, her hands still clutching the apples, her lips pursed tightly, as though trying to suppress the weight of what LeBron had just revealed. Around them, the crowd began to shift, though none dared to break the tension. The young mother who had hurried her child away earlier was now glancing back, her eyes wide, as though seeing the scene with a new understanding. A man who had been reaching for a carton of milk paused, his hand hovering midair, his gaze fixed on LeBron with a quiet reverence. Even the teenage cashier, who had been nervously tapping her fingers on the register, stood still, taking in the profound exchange. LeBron's story was not just personal, it was universal, a thread that connected the past to the present. His great-great-grandfather's life as a sharecropper, the struggle to survive in a system that denied him his humanity, his great-grandfather's painful memories of slavery, all of it was part of a larger story that the elderly woman, and perhaps many others, had never fully confronted. It was a history they had ignored, swept under the rug for convenience or comfort. But now, in this small corner of the grocery store, that history had come alive, and in the most unexpected of ways, it was forcing the woman and the crowd to reckon with it. For a moment, there was no sound. No one moved. Even the soft clink of cans and the rustling of plastic bags had stopped. The fluorescent lights above seemed to hum, a little quieter, as if the entire room had held its breath. LeBron's calm presence stood in stark contrast to the tension in the air. He didn't need to shout to be heard. His words had already reached deep into the hearts of those who were listening. The elderly woman's face had turned an ashen shade, her defiance wilting under the weight of LeBron's legacy. Her eyes flicked around the store, searching for some semblance of support, but there was none. No one came to her defense. The man who had stood by the potatoes earlier nodded slightly, his expression one of quiet understanding. The young employee who had frozen near the bananas now shifted his weight, as if finally releasing the tension he'd been holding. LeBron's words, though spoken quietly, had shattered something in that moment. The history he had recounted wasn't just the story of one man, one family. It was the story of an entire people whose pain had been woven into the very fabric of the nation. His great-grandfather's sacrifice in war, his mother's quiet dedication as a teacher, his father's steadfast belief in hard work, these weren't just anecdotes. They were the heartbeat of a people who had fought for dignity, respect, and a place in a world that had never fully embraced them. And yet, despite all that had been said, the woman still stood there, silent. Her face was flushed, and her eyes betrayed a conflict, a mixture of shame and confusion. LeBron's calm gaze remained fixed on her, not with bitterness, but with a kind of sorrowful understanding. She might not change in this moment, but the seed of reflection had been planted, and it would not be easily uprooted. As the minutes passed, the store began to hum again, the atmosphere thick with silent reflection. The crowd moved, but not as before. The tension had broken, but the impact of what had occurred was still rippling through the aisles. LeBron, though he had stood his ground with grace and conviction, could feel the weight of the moment settle into him as well. He didn't expect an immediate apology. He didn't need it. What mattered now was the seed of change he had helped plant. In the quiet after the storm, LeBron gathered his groceries, his mind still processing the exchange. He wasn't angry anymore, nor did he feel the need to speak further. What had been said, and how it had been said, was enough. The store once again resumed its usual rhythm, but for those who had witnessed the moment, it would never feel quite the same. There was a new understanding in the air, a recognition of something that could no longer be ignored. And as the elderly woman wheeled her cart away, the murmurs of the crowd grew, not in defense of her, but in acknowledgement of the truth that had been spoken. LeBron glanced over his shoulder before walking toward the checkout line, feeling the weight of the moment linger with him. He had shared a story of history, but more than that, he had shared a moment of humanity. And in that silence, he had allowed everyone to hear it. As LeBron made his way to the checkout, the murmurs of the crowd lingered behind him. The atmosphere in the store had shifted, no longer just a place for shopping, but a space where a conversation had begun, one that would echo far beyond the aisles. He placed his items on the conveyor belt, his mind still processing the exchange. The cashier, who had witnessed it all, met his eyes with a silent understanding, her expression softened. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with gratitude. LeBron gave her a small nod, not needing to say more. His actions had already spoken volumes. Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As LeBron stepped into his car, he glanced toward the entrance, where the elderly woman was pulling away, her face unreadable. It wasn't the confrontation that had been important, he realized, but the moment that followed, the silence that allowed for reflection. In the following days, news of the incident spread through the community. People spoke of LeBron's composed dignity, of how his words had stirred something within them. The elderly woman, though she never approached him again, began to change, slowly reconsidering the beliefs she had clung to for years. It wasn't immediate, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. For LeBron, the aftermath was a quiet victory, a reminder that sometimes change doesn't come from force, but from calm reflection and the courage to speak the truth when it's needed most.